Hello, this is Warhammer Workshop, and here is episode 1 of my gaming podcast, Nintendo or Sega Searching for Memories. This is inspired by a documentary I plan on making to go along with my Games Room project. As the title suggests, I am searching for old memories with focus on a singular memory, and I cannot recall if it's a memory of the Nintendo 64 or the Sega. All I know is it's a fighting game where you are able to smash cars and break barrels in some kind of training mode. I have an idea of what it is, Street Fighter 2, and if this is true, I don't think it was for the Nintendo 64, which means it must be for the Sega or Super NES, and this is where my search begins. Although I am 90% certain it is Street Fighter 2, and the console is the Sega Genesis. Note that this is not a war between the two, although I will be going into that, stating the differences, stats, and my own views regarding the systems and companies. To get the ball rolling, as it were, I'm going to start with my gaming history from age 5 to 22, 2018 as we speak. This is a podcast entitled The Japanese Gaming Empires, My Gaming History. This is denoting the three console company giants, Japan's Nintendo, Sony and Sega. Although Sony isn't just a console/games company. This will be split between my own history and stats/my views regarding the companies and their related media and success. It's going to be a cross between a history series, podcast series and otherwise, meaning it will have the format of a podcast, just being audio to listen to for free here on YouTube. However, it will be shorter in duration and largely scripted. My gaming journey began in my childhood home in the north of England, where I lived from ages 1 to 7, which I will show and explain further in the documentary. I began playing video games at around age 5 on the Nintendo 64 and Sega. I don't remember owning any game systems myself in the early days. However, I remember my brother's N64 and playing GoldenEye 007 and some combat titles, not to mention Mario and Sonic. Two of the most iconic game characters of all time and successful game series of all time, created by Nintendo and Sega respectively. This is reflected in the background of this. The year would have been 2000. Two of my older brothers are big fans of the three Japanese giants, Nintendo, Sega and Sony, with one of them being a strong fan of the former two, and a serious gamer and technologist, having started with the old Segas and possibly the NES, long before Sony and Microsoft were on the table. Which brings us to the mid-1990s and why I was exposed to Nintendo and Sega rather than Sony, although the PlayStation 1 came out 2 years before the Nintendo 64 in 1994. To my knowledge, we did not own any Sega or otherwise systems, and if I can recall, instead, he had the Sega, which came out the same year. And I did not have a PS1 until we moved to our new home in a town over. I must have been 8 or 9, with the year being 2003 or so. I remember buying a brand new PS1 and it was the greatest thing in the world. I played for hours and hours on an uncommon game called M&M's Shell Shocked, which came out in 2002, and Buzz Lightyear of Star Command 2000, which I still own to this day. And my favourite game without question for the PS1 is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which I do not remember ever fully completing. Although I came close a few years ago, I may try and complete the game on camera in the future, if I can hook up a capture card to the PS2, otherwise I will have to document it stage by stage with pictures. Now we come to the 6th generation in the early 2000s, and of course the Dreamcast in 1999 by Sega, which I cannot recall if we had. And for me we come to the early to mid 2000s. The PlayStation 2 had a head start over the GameCube and Xbox by 1 year, coming out in 2000. I must have bought a PS2 sometime before the mid 2000s, and this is, for fair reason, the greatest selling console of all time, although it was helped by the fact they had all markets to sell to, endless amounts of money, and were directly helped by Nintendo in creating the early model for the PlayStation, which the PS2 is built upon. And there were a few CD-based consoles before the PS1, meaning it was not an original idea and not the first to use discs, but still the product turned out to be one of the greatest consoles ever made. But also some poor choices by Nintendo meant the GameCube largely failed and the PS2 was unstoppable. Although Nintendo was the first to create the protruding analog stick with the N64 controller in 1996, which you can see on almost every controller since said time. Although the PS1 was released in 1994, it did not have the analog sticks until 1997. The N64 controller is also simply better and wonderfully keeps the arcade and vintage feel with the central analog stick, yet also has all the buttons and D-pad found on the other controllers. And to my knowledge, the N64 was the first controller to house 4 controller slots, giving it the capability of creating mass gameplay/experience with games such as GoldenEye and Mario Kart 64. Still, the only thing which has a chance at beating my PS1, Nintendo, Sega and otherwise memories is the PlayStation 2, which I could talk about for hours, including the fact you could listen to CDs and play your PS1 games. You also have a system that is greater than the PS1 in every way, and better than the Xbox, GameCube and Dreamcast in most ways. However, overall Sony won this battle for me from the very beginning, with my PS1 games being played better than ever, and my beloved PS2 games such as Tony Hawk, Aggressive Inline, Worms 3D, SSX Tricky and others. Yet there is a strong argument that objectively the GameCube is a better gaming system, or at least just as good. Xbox-wise, the only thing I remember about the Xbox is Halo 2 and its complete failure to come close to the Japanese systems. My brother was on home computers by this time and skipped this generation. The next generation, however, brought some of the greatest consoles ever forged. The Nintendo Wii, the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, the only good console ever created by Microsoft. Personally, I played the Xbox 360 and became very good at Call of Duty. However, I have not played the Xbox in years, and it is without question both the greatest thing Microsoft has ever done console-wise and the worst system of the 7th generation, despite having a 1-year head start and an excellent system. And the Wii gives you a GameCube inside, free online, the first motion control console, and all the Nintendo icons, making it the best for fitness and also the cheapest. Also, the Wii library coupled with the GameCube library can stand up to the great PlayStation 2. Statistics don't lie, and nor do ideas. The Wii sold over 100 million units, whereas the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 each sold 80 million. The only other consoles to sell 100 million units are the PlayStation 1 and 2. And so my brother was back in the game with, of course, the Nintendo Wii. It was much more enjoyable and energetic than any of the other consoles. Me and my brother played for hours on Link's crossbow training. Almost all of us skipped the 8th generation due to several factors, including lack of reward, creativity and usefulness. Facts don't lie, and nor do what people want. The fact is nobody really wanted the Wii U in 2012 due to mobile phones and other reasoning, and the Xbox One is almost completely pointless in face of the PlayStation 4 and other systems such as Nintendo Wii and Xbox 360 and the former PlayStation 3, and sales showcased this perfectly. The Xbox One sold nearly 20 million units, making it one of the biggest failures in console history, having barely beaten sales of the Xbox 2001, and it may be overtaken by the Nintendo Switch 2017, and it lost to the 2600 1977 and Genesis 1988. In 2017, the hybrid system Nintendo Switch was released and seems to be doing what the Wii U couldn't, and may have a real chance moving forward. Which brings us to the present moment, but I have completely omitted handheld devices and overall figures, so let's go back. Indeed, some of the greatest consoles by sale are handheld and were created by Nintendo, namely the Nintendo DS, Game Boy, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance, and the Nintendo 3DS. The other is Sony's PlayStation Portable, which in fact I personally had. It was my PS2, only it was in my hands. It played DVDs, it had some great games and was well built and designed. However, this is where my brother stepped in, between 6th and 7th generation. The Nintendo DS came out in 2004, the greatest handheld device including phones of any kind since the Nintendo Game Boy. It was interactive touchscreen, not to mention Guitar Hero and the Nintendo family of characters. The second most sold gaming console in history goes to just this, the original DS. Just 1 million units behind the PlayStation 2, which was released 4 years earlier and was built upon the PlayStation, which was the first console to break 100 million units sold. Going back some time, of course, sticking with the Game Boy, my brother had the original Nintendo Game Boy, and I remember the Game Boy Color, mostly playing Donkey Kong Country before I ever played the PlayStation. And then at some point during the mid-2000s, the new thing in town which everybody had, and they were mostly playing Pokemon, was the Game Boy Advance SP, the small square device with a flip-up screen. Overall, I would say my gaming history has been planted firmly within Sony's PlayStation line, with a hint of Microsoft and Sega, and an elegant lining of Nintendo. Time-wise, I've spent more time on the Xbox 360 and PS2 more than anything else. Following that would be the PS1 and PSP, and then Nintendo's Game Boys, Wii, DS, 64 and GameCube, with the least amount of time being spent elsewhere. I would say the greatest console for me would be the PlayStation 2, with the most hours spent on the Xbox 360, purely due to the fact I happened to play this rather than the PS3, and 95% of this time was spent on Call of Duty in my mid-teens. And the greatest enjoyment was found within Nintendo and then Sony, and we cannot forget Sega with Sonic the Hedgehog. The fact is Sony was powerful, and to my memory in every household by the mid-2000s, with the largest games console library of all time, with many being third party. However, the statistics do not lie, the ideas and creativity do not lie, and the icons do not lie. Nintendo, without question, is the single greatest and most important games and console company in history, having created the greatest consoles, ideas, characters, storylines, soundtracks from the very beginning, and having dominated the handheld market from 1989 to the present day. Despite the PlayStation home systems, many argue that Sega is a greater company than that of Sony, because Sega has been there longer, added more, and has created the better games and characters at the very least. Not to mention it is purely a games company, whereas Sony is not. Not to mention the NES and Super NES alone sold as many units as any of the other systems, other than the massive PlayStation 2, which sold 155 million units. However, if we take the top 16 selling home console games of all time, 7 were Nintendo, 4 were Sony, 3 were Microsoft, with the other 2 being the 2600 and Sega Genesis, and the ones under the 16 being dominated by Sega. Handheld-wise, Nintendo crushed everything and everybody with ease, other than, as I said, the PlayStation Portable, which comes in third, and the Sega Gear did better than the PlayStation Vita. Nintendo is the best-selling company in history, having nearly 700 million sales to Sony's second place, and nearly half, 474 million. Sony with the PlayStation 1, 2, 3 and 4 does beat Nintendo in home system sales, but not even by double, and the four systems are arguably worse than Nintendo's 4, plus the GameCube in the Wii being the 5th, the Nintendo Wii, 64, NES and U, for example. In terms of handheld, Nintendo sold 415 million units and Sony sold 86 million, with third place being in overall fourth, Sega, selling 14 million. You can liken Nintendo's dominance to that of Bobby Fischer in 1972. The Game Boy line alone has outsold the Xbox line and almost every other line except the PlayStation. Also, games-wise, Nintendo has created more best-selling games than any other company and almost has no rival. 9 out of the top 15 games of all time are Nintendo games, 5 of them being for the Wii, 3 of them being exercise-based games, the rest being Mario and Pokemon. The company in second is Activision with the Call of Duty line, and then Rockstar Games with the GTA line. In first place we have Tetris, which was put there by Nintendo themselves via the Game Boy. The second is Minecraft by Mojang, and the top 50 is split between Nintendo, Activision and the Pokemon Company, which was itself aided by Nintendo. The other companies, Sony, Sega and Microsoft, all have one game on the top 50 list. However, if you remove the games which came with the consoles themselves, you come to roughly the same conclusion, only you remove half or so of the Nintendo games and some of the Activision games. And in terms of the greatest games ever created, that is split between arcade, Nintendo, PC and Sony, with a hint of Sega, with Nintendo and arcade taking the best ones until the late 1990s when the PlayStation and PC came into play. Some worth noting, Nintendo-wise, would be Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, GoldenEye 007, Super Mario 64, Donkey Kong Country, Final Fantasy, the original Donkey Kong, Pokemon, The Legend of Zelda, Super Mario Kart and Super Mario Bros. 3, along with the entire lines aforementioned. And the most sold and greatest games by consoles easily goes to Nintendo, with Sony, Microsoft and Sega oftentimes far behind. The Wii has some of the most sold games, with titles such as Mario Kart and Sports Resort coming in at over 30 million sales, and the DS with 30 million sales with New Super Mario Bros. And 10 million sales for the Super Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64 for the Nintendo 64. Whereas the best-selling Xbox 360 game is GTA 5 at 17 million and 17 million for GTA San Andreas for the PS2 and 20 million for GTA 5 on the PS3. In terms of game franchises, Nintendo crushes this as well, with Mario, Super Mario, and then also Pokemon, namely for the Nintendo Game Boy. And then coming in at much less than half of Nintendo is Call of Duty and GTA. Under that we have the Wii series, and then some other titles, and then back to Nintendo. Of course, it is worth noting that Nintendo had a pretty bad relationship with third-party and mature audiences, whereas Sony did not, which has created some great games and some of the most successful series. Personally, my favourite games are split between Nintendo, Sony, and smaller companies, such as the British game Worms, which found itself onto both Nintendo and Sony systems, with focus being on Worms 3D, and Aggressive Inline, created by Underground Entertainment, the company which created Madden NFL 96 for the SEGA. Either way, overall, in terms of game console companies, the three Japanese giants Nintendo, SEGA and Sony are the three big ones, with the fourth being Microsoft and the fifth being Atari, or the other way around depending on a few factors. Note, many serious gamers and collectors believe that SEGA is superior to Sony, but most agree that Nintendo is the greatest. Well, here we are in the present moment, and I have come to believe this to some degree, that Nintendo is endlessly superior in almost every way, and Japan in general. Having played almost all modern systems from the age of 5, having enjoyed and all mastered countless games, and having recorded years of time on a dozen consoles, I can tell you that in most ways Nintendo is superior, and Japan's companies in general are completely crushing. In fact, very little of my time, console-wise, has been spent outside of Japan, and it has been fairly well split game-wise between the Eastern and Western companies and creations. However, out of the list of games I enjoy the most, and systems I have played the most, that goes to Nintendo. I have also played more Nintendo systems, handheld and home, more than any other company, simply because Nintendo has made more consoles and almost always better consoles and game series since the beginning. With time, you will realise the simple and beautiful is the way to game, and that almost exclusively means Nintendo, Sega and then Sony, which compelled me on this journey, starting with the Nintendo Wii for the exercise benefits and classic games such as Link's Crossbow Training and Mario Kart, which I bought recently and will most likely do a video on. However, this is a perfect time to search for my forgotten memory by collecting some Nintendo and Sega systems, along with any and every game I care to, over the following months. I know my local games guy, as we will call him, has a cheap Game Boy Advance, Dreamcast and Super NES for sale, which I may pick up soon. If you speak to experts at all, you will hear them say more often than not, such companies, systems and games are timeless because of their simplicity, attention to detail, enjoyment, reward and beauty. I'm starting to realise raw power and realistic graphics isn't nearly as important as the other factors and elements, and additional elements such as DVD capability also isn't as important as the gaming elements. There is a reason the older systems sold almost as well as the newer systems, and why the older games such as Tetris, Mario and Donkey Kong are some of the greatest in history, with emphasis being on Nintendo, even though their graphics have not really improved much compared to GTA, Call of Duty and computer games. In fact, the most iconic handheld device in history is the original Game Boy, and the most iconic home system is the original NES, both by Nintendo, which helped pave the way for tomorrow and spawned some of the greatest and most sold series and individual games and consoles in history. However, I have no real agenda here. All the companies are wonderful and they have given so much to the world, and I have spent much time on them all. In fact, I suggest you collect from Sony, Nintendo and Sega, namely the PS2/3, PSP, Sega, Saturn/Genesis, and really almost the entire Nintendo line. Also some Microsoft creations and elements are wonderful as well, but focus ought to be on Nintendo, then Sony and Sega, followed by anything else you care for. I hope you can see how deeply I've come to love Nintendo. I suppose it has been silently building up all my life. I've just not canonized it before, not to mention my undying love for the original Sony PlayStation systems. However, you are also open to all systems, games, companies, devices and otherwise, and you are free to play as many or as few as you want. That is the ultimate beauty of it. Well, that is the not-so-potted history of my gaming life from age 5 to 22. Please tell me in the comments below if I got anything terribly wrong, or just your own view regarding which system is better, personally or objectively, or any suggestions you may have for me moving forward with gaming videos. I have been Warhammer Workshop, and you have been listening to Nintendo or Sega, a gaming podcast. The first episode, the Japanese Gaming Empires, my gaming history. Thank you.